All right, so we're going to just kind of fly through weed control in peach and cherry orchard systems. So weeds in orchards. This is the obligatory slide as to why weeds are important. First and foremost, weeds are the direct competitors for our crops for water, light, and nutrients, and it's particularly going to be for water in early orchard systems. Weeds, when they get large, can impact the deposition of crop protection chemicals, say for the treatment of pathogens and insects. They provide habitat for invertebrate and vertebrate pests. Art talked about this. They can alter crop microclimates, and that's going to influence disease development. It's going to interfere with harvest operations potentially, and if you get something like poison ivy getting on trees, it can provide potential injury to the workers directly. So this was some work that was done in 1985, and this was looking at Bermuda grass interference in newly planted peach trees, and basically it just shows that the more cover you have of weeds, the more reductions in tree growth that you're going to see. So this is really crucial for keeping weeds out of orchards, particularly when they're young, starting clean and staying clean. This is just some more information, just basically kind of say the exact same thing. The critical period for getting those young fruit trees established is going to be May to July. When you're thinking about maximizing trunk diameter growth, the critical weed-free period for bearing trees is going to be bud break to 30 days after bloom if you want to maintain yields. That came out of Ontario. Andrew McCrae out of NC State University found that the critical weed-free period was for bloom to 12 weeks after bloom for maximizing peak fruit size and number. And really, Mitchum and Lockwood, they're again out of NC State, that first 3 years after peach planting is really going to be necessary to maximize tree growth. This is just basically some of the same information for tart cherries that was done. Early season weed control gives you more nodes, longer internodes, greater leaf area, greater trunk circumference. But late season weed control is going to be important for yields. And again, that's going to sort of harken back to the previous slide where, if you want to maximize your fruit yield, it's going to be around that flowering period. But for maximizing the growth in the young trees, it's going to be that early season competition. So if we look at weed management strategies in orchards, first and foremost, if you're getting ready to put an orchard in, it doesn't matter what orchard, site selection. Understanding if you've got difficult to control weed species, such as perennial weeds that are present, because those weeds are going to cause problems for multiple years to come. This is a walnut orchard where I was working in California. This is field bindweed, Convolvulus arvensis. We have a lot of field bindweed in annual production systems. And when we transition those to the higher value tree and vine systems, we find that we start to have field bindweed problems in those production environments too. So you really have to be focused on managing those perennial weed species, even before you've got the orchard in the ground. That's going to be things like field bindweed, hedge bindweed, Canada thistle, yellow nutsedge, Johnson grass, curly dock, goldenrod. So either avoid sites that can't be managed or else aggressively suppress the weeds, whether it's physically or chemically, to get yourself a good start. So if we're going to talk about physical disturbance for a perennial weed control, basically you have to continuously deplete those underground nutrient reserves that are supporting that above ground growth and development. And for a lot of species, they found that this requires cultivation about every 7 to 14 days in a fallow system. In addition to depleting those underground nutrient reserves, it could desiccate potentially regenerative fragments, which can help prevent regrowth and reestablishment. Now, this kind of intense soil disturbance is going to be problematic with respect to soil structure, soil health, and the potential for erosion. So I'm not going to minimize it, but I'm just going to say you know, this is kind of historically what we have found with a lot of perennial species that we need to do. This is some work that was done with field bindweed in the 1940s, and just to show you kind of like the intensity that is needed. They were cultivating every 2 to 3 weeks, and they basically found that they had to cultivate for 2 to 2.5 fallow seasons to be able to eradicate those vines. And if you look to the right, this is field bindweed. It's got root systems that can go down to about depths of about 30 feet. So that's why this kind of intense management was really necessary. So just be aware of the biology and the ecology of these species and what it might take if you're going to physically be disrupting them in your systems. It's important to understand that infrequent cultivation, if this is a strategy you're looking at, can actually make the problem worse. While cultivation can exhaust energy and it can expose those underground structures to desiccation, infrequent cultivation just can move those root, rhizome fragments, bulbs around the field and can allow them to become reestablished. And this is actually some field bindweed in California that a farmer was dragging around on the back of his tractor, moving it around the field. So we often use systemic herbicides to go in and manage perennial weeds. A lot of that is glyphosate, WSSA-9. If you're using broadleaf weeds, we might be using the auxinic herbicides, WSSA-4. And their systemic herbicides are really effective tools because they can be translocated throughout the target plants and kill more tissue than what was just treated. So if you were going in with something like a contact herbicide like paraquat, you're just going to burn off any tissue that paraquat comes into contact with. Products like glyphosate or the grass herbicides, the ACCase inhibitors with respect to grasses, they actually move through the plant and they are going to be able to effect control at distant tissues. But single applications are not going to be effective. But it's also important to understand that the timing of applications is going to be really crucial to maximize the capture of the herbicide and to make sure it's properly moving systemically in the plant. This is some work that was done in the 1970s and 80s, and this was done with field bindweed. And basically what they found is that field bindweed control with Roundup was improved between May and August when it was applied in the summer when the plants were flowering, as opposed when they made early spring applications or they started getting into fall when the plants were more vegetative. And I just want you to be thinking about kind of the biology, the ecology, and the nature of perennials and why you might not see equal control with these species all year round. So this is just a theoretical bindweed curve for you know, a theoretical control curve for field bindweed. Emerging shoots, when these perennials are just getting out of the ground, you are just not going to have enough biomass to capture enough herbicide to control these really extensive root systems. Also, when you have these shoots emerging, what you have is you have flow and movement away from the roots. And with a weed like field bindweed, you want to move glyphosate to the roots, and it's a phloem translocated herbicide. So if everything's moving away from the roots, you're not getting it to go where it needs to go. In the fall, these plants are going to be senescing. You're going to have pest infestations that might reduce their biomass and vigor and can reduce the amount of area, you know, to capture the herbicides, as well as bud dormancy, limiting translocation to active meristems. So I'm not sure that we always have a very good handle on when is it too late to make a systemic application to, you know, a perennial weed. You know, there is going to be a cutoff point, and that's work that I'm hoping to do while I'm here in New York. But just understand is that not all timings are going to be equally effective. And we really want, when these plants are vigorously growing, if we're going to go in and treat with systemic herbicides. So some other strategies that are non-chemical related for management in orchards, cultivation. Shallow cultivation, 1 to 2 inches, 4 to 6 times per season can be effective against young annual weeds. Used aggressively though, it can damage trees and facilitate soil erosion and organic matter loss. Mulching, we found mulch can provide physical suppression of germination and emergence of weeds. It's costly and difficult to source. It can provide a habitat for vertebrate pests, and it can interfere with subsequent weed control efforts. So you really want to be aware of, takeaways, and trade-offs with strategies that you're going to use for weed management. If anyone's doing flame weeding, it can be used to manage annual species, but broadleaves are going to be better controlled than grasses, and that's going to be due to the position of the meristem. The meristem on grasses is going to be below the ground for a lot of the growing season, and it's going to be protected from damage. That's why contact herbicides might also not be very effective. It doesn't burn the plants. That's what you're thinking is you're going to burn the plants down. Technically not. What it does do with flame weeding is it causes cells to vaporize and cells to burst. Just like a chemical sprayer though, a flame weeder operation, a unit, is going to have to be calibrated. It's also, you're going to have to monitor your ground speed, just like a chemical sprayer. It's not just going out there and burning willy-nilly. And there's also fire concerns if you've got dried plant material or vegetation. We tried using this when I was in California, and we basically just had, some students were out trying flame weeding, and the teacher going behind them and basically stomping out fires, because California is so dry. So understand that that's definitely a concern. Permanent sod is with a weed-free strip under the trees is probably, really frankly, for a great amount of the area, our most common management strategy for the orchard floor. Reduces erosion, it provides support for heavy equipment, reduces dust, insulates against cold penetration, again, in addition to other benefits. Weeds should be managed as well as possible before planting, especially perennials, kind of a throwback to our previous slides. Mode for management of permanent sods, but slow growing and dwarf species can reduce the number of passes required, but also understand that mowing, if perennials do get established, it might not effectively manage them because they have that nutrient reserves to regrow. The same with prostrate or spreading weeds. They may just be under the mower deck, and you're going to find it hard to keep those plants from spreading into the tree row. Now, herbicides. And we're probably going to focus a lot on herbicides because, frankly, in the United States, we use a lot of herbicides for weed management. And not surprisingly, because, these are really optimized tools for us to take advantage of. Herbicides, in fact, really, when we look across all of our pesticide classes, this was an older slide, but I don't think the data has changed too much, are really one of the top products that we use across all cropping systems in the agronomic sector. This was 2012 data, and we found that we're putting about 0.6 billion pounds of active ingredient of herbicides in the United States, and that's costing user groups about $6.2 billion. So we're using a lot of herbicides, so we need to understand the herbicides and use them well. With respect to the herbicides that we've got, they can be broken up and looked at in a couple of different ways. There's the growth inhibiting herbicides. So this is going to cover a couple of groups. So this is going to be our WSSA1. These are going to be our ACCase inhibitors, our grass inhibitors like Sethoxydim, which is a post-emergence product. WSSA2, which is rimsulfuron, which we can use pre or has a little bit of early post activity. Our WSSA3, these are going to be our yellow herbicides, our dinitroanilins, which are soil applied products. WSSA4, these are our synthetic auxins. 9, this is glyphosate. It's a post-emergence herbicide. It is the only herbicide in this group. And then WSSA 20 and 9. So this is going to be products like diclofenac and indaziflam. We also have herbicides where we talked about herbicides that are going to slow down or interfere with crop growth. We have herbicides that are out there that just destroy tissues. That's going to be WSSA 5 and 7, which are our photosystem 2 inhibitors. It's going to be diuron, simacine, terbicil. WSSA 10, which is going to be glufosinate. WSSA 12, which is solacam, norflorazone. The 14s are going to be our PPO inhibitors. Products like carfentrazone and paraflufen, which is going to be AIM and Venue, are post-emergence applied, whereas products like flumioxazin and oxaflorphin are going to be primarily pre, but have some early post activity. And then WSSA 22, which is going to be paraquat and a photosystem 1 electron diverter. We can also talk about our herbicides in addition to how they control weeds, is to when they're applied and to what they are applied to. So we're going to break it out now, and we're just going to cover this kind of quickly, the pre-emergence herbicides. So these are going to be herbicides that are going to be applied to the soil. So the first one is going to be our ALS inhibitors. This is going to be rimsulfuron, which is going to be matrix. It's mostly broad spectrum. This is a pre-emergence herbicide with early post activity, so it could get very small seedlings, but really consider a tank mix partner. It's got a short residual time in the soil, so it needs sequential applications or a tank mix partner if you're going to expect season-long residual control, and there's tree age restrictions. Our yellow herbicides, the microtubule inhibitors, are in WSSA 3. These are grass herbicides. They have no post activity with the exception of curb. So foliar treatments are going to be needed for the management of any kind of standing vegetation. These products are Oryzalin, which is surflan, which can be used in newly planted orchards once soil is settled. It can get some small seeded broadleaves like pigweeds, but again, better on grasses. Pral H2O, again, mostly grass control, but can get some lamb's quarters and pigweeds. If you're using Pral 3.3 EC, this is a non-bearing herbicide only. Pronomide, or curb, is a restricted use pesticide. It's got pre and early post activity, tree age restrictions. It's got to be used in fall before free up, but when temperatures don't exceed 55 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's got limited activity on annual broadleaves. Again, WSSA 3 are grass herbicides primarily. WSSA 5 and 7, these are photosystem 2 inhibitors. These tend to be better on annuals, broadleaves, unlike the previous class, which is better on grasses. So they're going to need partners to improve grass control. Diuron is going to be on peaches only. Some formulations can be restricted use, and there's tree age restrictions associated with these herbicides. Simazine is a restricted use herbicide. It can't be used in Long Island. Tree age restrictions, and understand on low pH soils, it's going to have reduced activity. So it's not going to control weeds as well as it might on a neutral or higher pH. WSSA 12 is a carotenoid biosynthesis inhibitor. This is actually going to provide season-long control of annual grasses, and it's also going to provide some perennial grass suppression. This is Solecam norflorazone. It's not for use in Long Island. There are tree age restrictions associated with it. It can control many broadleaf weeds, but tank mix partners are probably going to be required with this plant depending on your weed spectrum. The WSSA 14 herbicides are going to be our PPO inhibitors. These tend to be better on broadleaves, although some can be broad spectrum depending on the active ingredient. The first is going to be flumioxazin, which is Chateau herbicide. Its use is going to vary with tree age and protection, whether you're protecting young stems with non-porous tree wraps. It's a pre-emergence herbicide. It can have some early post, but it needs a tank mix partner. But in light of that, it can also enhance the activity of some post-emergence herbicides that it's applied with. Oxaflorphin is for dormant applications only before bud swell or after harvest due to volatility injury concerns. This also can have some post activity, but it's going to need a tank mix partner for grasses. Our last group of pre-emergent herbicides is going to be our WSSA 20 and 29 group. These are cell wall biosynthesis inhibitors. They can provide broad spectrum control, and Keseron, diclobinil, actually has some perennial weed suppression. So diclobinil pre and does have some early post activity, cherries only. November 15th to February 15th applications because of volatility losses. There are tree age restrictions. This is a translocated herbicide, so it can move through the roots. Indaziflam, Allion, is group 29. This is a restricted use pesticide, not for use on Long Island. Tree age restrictions. There's also water protection restrictions if you're looking, and all of this information can be found in the Pest Management Guidebook. There are water protection restrictions. Unlike Caseron, this is not going to control emerged weeds. So, you know, you're going to have to actually manage the vegetation in advance of this going down, because this really has to be applied to a clean soil surface to get good soil herbicide contact and improve efficacy. So this is just some general notes about the pre-emergence herbicides in general. And this is going to go back to what we just said about Allion. First and foremost, soil contact. We're using most of these as residual products. These are soil applied products. And in that case, soil contact for a lot of them is going to be critical. So you have to be very mindful of leaf litter or trash or standing vegetation or other interference that is going to impact the deposition of these products. And some products like Allion, like Matrix, are going to be probably more sensitive than a product like Caseron might be. The stability of these herbicides is going to differ. Some of them are going to have to be activated much more quickly than others. And if you look at the labels, you're going to see activate within 24 hours, within 48 hours, within 2 weeks, whereas something might be more 3 weeks where it can sit on the soil surface. So understanding the stability of these products differs. That's going to influence their activation requirements and the time that can pass before incorporation is going to require, and then you lose residual activity. Pre's differ in their solubility and their absorption potential to the soil. So that's going to affect leaching potential, but it's also going to affect how long these residues can remain in the soil and do their job. So something like Matrix has a very short residual time, maybe 60 days, maybe 90 days, very short-lived, very short residual time. Rates are going to differ in response to soil type and weed identity, so you have to pay attention to that. And that's also why you need to know what weeds you're dealing with. It also can affect residual control longevity. Again, some of these products have early post activity as well. I'm not sure I would rely on them alone for early post, weed control. They're going to need tank mix partners. See labels about those tank mix partners so you can expand that spectrum of control, whether it's from the residual activity or to burn down standing vegetation. And obviously pay attention to tree age restrictions, the seasonality of applications, and understand that spray contact, even if these are residual products, can cause injury to the trees themselves. The next slide I want to show you is just the injury. Like, we often think about drift injury, we often think about contact injury, we often think about use injury coming from contact herbicides, from foliar herbicides. This is actually Allion injury on young grapes. Allion has a pretty strict label for use in grape systems, and this was done in California. This is a pretty young raisin orchard. They went and put Allion out. It's also a sandy soil. So just be aware, we can see this injury from pre-emergence herbicides. With respect to our post-emergence products, our WSSA1s, these are going to be our grass-specific herbicides, and grasses have to be actively growing. These are systemic products. So you can't have grasses that are stressed due to water stress or temperature stress or some sort of other stress. Perennial grasses are probably going to need repeat treatment. Don't confuse sedges with grasses. The WSSA1 herbicides are not going to get things like nut sedge. They're not going to get broadleaf, so they're going to need broadleaf partners. This is going to come down to Fusilade DX, which can only be used in non-bearing orchards, not in Long Island, and Sethoxydim, which is for bearing and non-bearing systems. WSSA10, this is glutamine synthase inhibitors. This is Rely 280 or glufosinate. It's better on broadleaves than grasses, so again, tank mix partner. Not for use in Long Island. It's a contact herbicide. It does have a little bit of systemic movement, but do not treat it like a systemic herbicide. Do not confuse glufosinate with glyphosate. Glyphosate is a true systemic product. Glufosinate is not. So be very mindful of that and do not treat them similarly. Glufosinate is going to need to be applied to very, very, very small weeds. The WSSA 14, the PPO inhibitors that we consider to be more burn down herbicides than PRE, this is going to be AIM, carfentrazone. It's a contact herbicide, better on broadleaves than grasses. Weeds have got to be small. It's often used as a glyphosate partner. Same thing with Venue. Contact herbicide must be applied to small weeds. Also glyphosate, often used as a partner. Paraquat is the WSSA 22. It's an electron diverter, a broad spectrum herbicide that sometimes is a little bit better under cloudy conditions because it acts on the photosystems and so, photosynthesis, so it doesn't burn the plants as quickly. This is a restricted use contact herbicide. It needs smaller plants, and there are new paraquat requirements that are associated with this product, particularly as of November 14th, 2019. There's updated labeling and requirements for herbicide products and use requirements for products containing paraquat. Purchasers, applicators, mixers, or loaders, or tank cleaners need to be certified applicators, and you must complete paraquat training every 3 years and get 100% score on exam at the end of the training. I have been looking to see if New York State actually offers any kind of paraquat training, and I haven't found it yet. But if you go to extension.org, you should be able to get paraquat training or contact your local CCE personnel about opportunities if they know if it's going to be offered. Coming in November 2020, all containers of paraquat, even less than 120-gallon drums, need to comply with closed system standards. So be aware of how paraquat regulations are going to continue to change. Some general notes about post-emergence herbicides. Size matters and coverage counts. Even with our systemic products, we've got to make sure we get good coverage, and we really need to be going after weeds when they are physically small. Weather and weed vigor can really impact herbicide performance. Weed vigor, particularly with our systemic herbicides. It might seem counterintuitive, but we want these plants actively growing so they can move these systemic herbicides around through all of the tissue. Perennials are going to require multiple treatments. Pay attention to tree age and bearing restrictions. And remember that spray that comes into contact with stems, foliage, and blooms can cause injury. So just want to show you some kind of symptomology of injury. This is on cherry. The first picture is actually an ALS herbicide. ALS herbicides are going to show some leaf deformations. They're also going to show purpling of the veins and of the leaf tissue. By the way, all of these pictures I'm showing come from the UC IPM Herbicide Symptomology Gallery, and I'm going to be building a new one for New York starting this summer, and we're going to put it online, and hopefully we're going to have better quality, high-resolution images. The middle one is an example of injury from 2,4-D, where you see those leaf distortions and the curling and twisting. But the one on the rightmost, that's glyphosate. And you might look at that and think, oh my God, the puckering, the distorting, that kind of looks like 2,4-D. Yeah, it kind of does, sometimes at really low rates. Glyphosate can mimic 2,4-D injury on a lot of plants, and actually so can the ALS inhibiting herbicides. So we've got to be mindful of that there are symptoms and there are characteristic symptoms of injury due to herbicides, but sometimes depending on the rate, it could be modified. And that's also another thing I'm really hoping to do is get different rates so we can really see the variability in the injury that can develop. So this is injury, this is herbicide injury from glufosinate, paraquat, and PPO in order. And all of these herbicides, we talked about them being those herbicides that are going to burn and cause tissue damage. This is spray diff damage, and again, you can see it might be a little hard to tell some of these apart. We know we've got a contact herbicide that's probably causing, you know, tissue necrosis and death, but they all have that kind of, you know, similar symptom. So sometimes it's going to be hard to tell some of these products apart, but important to understand that this injury can occur, you know, from herbicide contact to the trees. This is an interesting one that I want to point out, is that peaches, and I'm not exactly sure which ACCAs, which grass herbicides can cause this damage. I'm not sure it's all of them. And I think this injury is due to a grass herbicide called halaxifop. But this is injury. So this is a grass herbicide on a broadleaf plant. We already talked that these herbicides aren't active on broadleaves, but this is damage to peaches from that grass herbicide. So understand that, you know, just because we're talking broadleaf plants doesn't mean that grass herbicides can't cause some sort of symptomology. Weed size and herbicide injury to trees. This is an apple orchard in Washington State. This just gets to really getting weeds while they're young. If these weeds start growing, you're pulling the boom up, you've got more potential to cause damage to tree tissue. And then that's what you can see here, where we have just burned those apple trees trying to manage the weeds that weren't managed early in the season. I do want to talk about herbicide resistance. Herbicide resistance is facing every single crop, so we have to be really, really aware of this in our perennial systems. Right now, this is the current state of herbicide resistance globally. 512 unique cases of herbicide resistance, 23 of our 26 known modes of action, and 166 different herbicides. So weeds aren't going away, and new strategies are always needed, but herbicide resistance is going to continue to threaten these tools. So this is actually resistant weeds in the US, and this was a slide I did for apples in New York, but it certainly applies here. This is herbicide resistant weeds by WSSA groups. So this is the number of weeds around the world that are resistant to the herbicides that we're using in our tree crops. So you can see basically every herbicide class that I just talked about, every WSSA group has some weeds somewhere in the world that have developed resistance to these products. Maybe we've only got a couple, but they're there. So no herbicide is really immune from the development of herbicide resistance. And this is going to include our soil apply herbicides. This is not just something that's a hallmark of the POST products. If we want to focus on the United States, and we want to focus on tree and vine systems around the world, we have 144 confirmed cases of herbicide resistance, 24 in the US, mostly in the Western US. So we have 13 species resistant to glyphosate, 8 to photosystem 2 inhibitors, and 2 or fewer to paraquat, the grass herbicides, ALS inhibitors, and glyphosate. But these are the species that we've seen resistance developing to, and these are common to here. So we have to be aware. Right now, this is herbicide resistance in New York, but I'm going to tell you, these 3 species haven't made it to the list, but we know we've got resistance. This is WATERHEMP, Palmer amaranth, and horseweed. We tend to think of these species as being resistant to, you know, in our agronomic systems, that's horseweed and soybeans in New York, but that's Palmer amaranth and almonds in California. So let's just be really mindful of, you know, herbicide resistance in weeds that are coming in. And that's my talk, and thank you very much.